Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to give folks just a few seconds to get into the Zoom room today. I see people are filtering in. It's always like the most, I will say, behind the scenes look, the most nerve-wracking part about a webinar is when you hit launch and then you secretly worry that you sent out the wrong link and no one comes in the room. But we've already got about 30 guests, so I think I sent the right link today. Welcome, folks. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you, everyone, for joining me today for part 3 of Fresh Energy's Energy Plus Summer Webinar Series. My name is Jo Olson. I'm the Senior Director of Communications and Engagement here at Fresh Energy. Fresh Energy is a Minnesota-based nonprofit working toward a vision of a just, prosperous, and resilient future powered by a shared commitment to a carbon-neutral economy. Now, energy and climate issues play out across our society in books and film, institutions of higher learning, our democracy, and the very air we breathe. Tailpipe emissions, natural gas in our homes, and other reliance on fossil fuels impacts air quality across the state. So today, we are going to discuss how we can incorporate health impacts into energy and climate discussions. But before we get too far along, I just want to thank our generous event sponsors who helped make this webinar series possible. Thank you to Great River Energy for joining us as a gold sponsor and Sunrun for joining us as a bronze sponsor. And I also want to extend a shout out and thank you to all of our promotional partners who helped spread the word about this event. I think this list is longer than it ever has been, and we've been running this series for about 3 years now. We're so grateful for these partnerships. And before I forget, the last 15 minutes of this webinar will be an audience Q&A, but you can submit your questions at any time. We are using Zoom's Q&A feature. So go ahead and find that button at the bottom of your screen, and you can type in your questions as you think of them. And you can even upvote questions from other folks that you like. And with that, I think I am ready to turn the mic over to my colleague, Margaret Cherne-Hendrick, Senior Lead of Innovation and Impact here at Fresh Energy.
Thank you so much, Jo, and welcome to everyone to the discussion today. I am really excited for this discussion. It's a super important and timely one, and we are joined by some really prestigious voices in this topic. So I'd like to turn to our panel of experts who are joining us today to discuss the connections between energy and health, from tailpipe emissions, natural gas and propane in our homes, and other reliance on fossil fuels. These things impact air quality across the state. And air quality, of course, ties directly to public health. I'm so excited to introduce our panelists. I'm joined today by Emma Hines, Health and Air Quality Associate on RMI's Carbon-Free Buildings Program, T. McClenty, Executive Director of Minnesota 350, and Jessie Carr Shmool, an epidemiologist at the Minnesota Department of Health. So in my role leading Fresh Energy's energy transition work, I've found myself, and in fact all of Fresh Energy staff, talking more and more about the ways in which we source and use energy relate to the public health crisis that we're seeing today. This conversation has become increasingly prominent over the past 5 years in particular, and the three of you with me today are living and breathing literally this work too. So I want to dedicate some time today to focus on your individual roles and work. Let me start with you, Emma. Emma is a Health and Air Quality Associate on RMI's Carbon-Free Buildings Program, where she works on climate, health, and air quality co-benefits of building electrification. She also served as a member of the teaching faculty for the Climate Change and Health Online Certificate Program with the Yale School of Public Health. Welcome, Emma. Take it away.
Thanks, Margaret. Let me get my screen shared with everybody. Could I get maybe a thumbs up from folks if you're able to see this? Great. Thank you. So today we are going to be talking about gas stoves. And like Margaret said, my name is Emma Hines, and I am coming to you today on behalf of RMI, formerly Rocky Mountain Institute. And we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to accelerate the clean energy transition. And personally, my background is in climate change and public health. So I'm going to start off today's really quick presentation by saying that there is a reason that we as a society are hooked on cooking with gas. For about a decade now, the gas industry has been working to keep us hooked on gas through a really long-standing advertising campaign to portray gas as classy and sophisticated and convince us that gas is natural. And I'll share these links to these Mother Jones articles in just a little bit. But what the gas industry doesn't want us to realize is that when you're cooking with a gas stove, you are essentially burning an open flame inside your home, and there are health consequences that come along with that. So back in 2020, RMI spearheaded the publication of a report on this topic with some great partners listed here. And this report synthesized the last 2 decades of research on this topic, which I'm going to summarize for you here today. So when you burn gas in a stove, you are releasing a couple of air pollutants into your home's air. These include carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, and particulate matter. And exposure to these pollutants can cause things like carbon monoxide poisoning, aggravation of respiratory symptoms, and even the development of asthma. And for a not so fun fact for this middle one on nitrogen dioxide, homes with the gas stoves have 50 to 400% higher nitrogen dioxide emissions than homes with electric stoves. And you may have also seen a couple of more recent studies come out on gas stoves for some other pollutants, a couple of which are actually leaking from our stoves when they're off. Those include methane and benzene. But I'm going to keep picking on nitrogen dioxide for a little bit because this is where we have a lot of evidence. There's a lot of numbers here on this slide, but what I want to get across to you all is that here in the US, we have outdoor standards for nitrogen dioxide, but we still don't have any regulation for our indoor air. And what this means is that certain kitchen activities, things like baking a cake in your gas oven, or even just boiling water on your gas stove, can release enough NO2 indoors that it would essentially be illegal outdoors. And this is pretty bad news because we spend a lot of our time indoors, up to 90%, a lot of which is spent in our homes, and 1 in 3 homes cook with gas today. And there are well-documented health risks for children in particular. So children living in a home with a gas stove have a 42% increased risk of experiencing asthma symptoms and a 24% increased risk of being diagnosed with asthma by a doctor. And there's a few reasons why children are particularly susceptible to air pollution from gas stoves, including things like higher breathing rates and developing lungs and immune systems. And it's also not just asthma that we're concerned about. Exposure to these pollutants can also end up aggravating other respiratory symptoms, leading to IQ, learning deficits, and also cardiovascular effects. So a lot to be concerned about. So I don't have a lot of time today, but with that information, you're probably still wondering, what am I supposed to do with all of this? So I have a couple of solutions for you, and I'm going to walk through them from most expensive to least expensive. So being really cautious to talk about the influence of cost here. So if you are particularly compelled after this presentation to get rid of your gas stove, and it's financially feasible, there are a couple of options where households can switch their gas stoves entirely for an electric one. And the options are electric resistance coil stoves, which are admittedly not the best. Up a step from there, we have glass smooth top, which are pretty good. And then a great option for folks is induction. And if any of these technology options are unfamiliar, I'm happy to talk through them more in a little bit more detail later. But maybe you know that you can't switch out your gas stove right now, or you're not completely sold. Maybe you're a renter, for example, and you don't have the authority to. There are some other options that you could undertake. You could try to shift some of your cooking events from gas to electric using the lower cost appliances you already have. Things like a toaster oven, an electric kettle. You could try out a plug-in induction cooktop, which is much more affordable. And then the last thing that I'll share with you all is that regardless of what you're cooking on, gas or electric, there are some great practices that you can take to protect your health. If you have an exhaust hood, always run it while you're cooking. Cook on the back burners to help sweep up pollutants into your hood. Open a window for natural ventilation if you don't have a hood, or install and maintain a carbon monoxide detector, especially if you are burning gas. So those 5 minutes really flew by. I couldn't say too much, but if what I've talked about is interesting and you want to learn more about gas appliances and their health risks and the benefits of going all electric, please check out our new toolkit called All Electric Homes, a Health Professional's Guide for more info. And I'll link that in the chat in just a little bit. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emma. It's really exciting to learn a bit more about some of the national work that RMI is leading, and we'll be excited to dig in a little bit more in the Q&A section coming later in the webinar. So now I'd like to turn to T and hear your perspective. T is the Executive Director of Minnesota 350 and has a nearly 20-year background in emergency medicine where she's seen firsthand the impact of climate on people's health. And in addition to that, T has witnessed this at home too. Her youngest son was born with asthma and continues to experience complications from it as a young adult. Many communities of color are hardest hit by the negative impacts of climate change, and I know this is a significant factor in your work at Minnesota 350 T. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. Great, so we have 5 minutes, so I will make sure that I don't use my East Coast speed and go too fast in these slides. So again, as Margaret said, my name is T. McClenty. I joined MN 350 in February. I'm excited to be part of this amazing team. The first slide, you'll see my family. That's what drives me. That's what drives my work. I have 3 sons. The young man in the back in the white shirt is the one who has asthma. I had asthma as a child and still walks around with a rescue inhaler. And then my oldest son is getting married this year in September, so I'm excited for him. And so that's what drives me. That's what makes me do my work. And then, you know, when we all know how we can just dive into our work, but I like to have some of my personal time, and I am a runner. And so that's how I reduce my stress. I ran 9 marathons, and I'm just happy that I can go outside and breathe the air and be able to run. And so that's very important to me. So climate has always been the intersect of my work, working 18 years in emergency medicine, and then in human services as well. Next slide, please. So our mission at MN 350 is to, as you can see on the slide, but we know that environmental justice goes beyond the conservation and individual actions. Environmental justice aims to address the oppressive and extractive systems that are at the very heart of so many of the world ills that we face today. Next slide, please. So we know that climate impacts fall the heaviest on low-income communities and communities of color. The same communities that oftentimes have the fewest resources available to them. And so that was one of the reasons why I wanted to join MN 350. MN 350 does a great job. We have thousands of volunteers. And what we're trying to do is have more communities of color be part of the work that we're doing. And so that we are representative of the communities that we are trying to provide those resources to. Next slide, please. So we know that race, even more than class, is the #1 predictor of the placement of toxic facilities in the US. Black children 17 and younger are 30 to 40% more likely to be diagnosed with asthma. In Minnesota, areas with the highest proportion of residents of color have more than 5 times the rate of emergency room visits that's linked to fine particle pollutions compared to areas with white residents. And I know this firsthand from working in an emergency room and also doing road medicine as a paramedic. The climate crisis is projected to cause an increase in mortality rates for Black people who are 41 to 60% more likely to die as a result of fine particle pollution. Next slide, please. So the same oppressive, extractive systems that are responsible for our nation's historic and ongoing gaps in wealth, health, education, and more continues. Historically, every significant transformation in our country has left frontline communities behind and widened the gap. And we at MN 350 and other of our partners say that we cannot sit back and allow this to continue to happen. If we want to move to transition to a clean energy economy, then we need to involve more communities of color. So we need you to join us in this fighting, deeply intertwined intersection. Next slide, please. that's what we do at MN 350. We are very much into taking action. We have, the next slide will talk a little bit about the work that we do, but we believe that in order to raise awareness, we need 37%. The number used to be 35, but 37% of Minnesotans to get involved. That's how we make change. And at the time when it was 37%, it was over 200,000. So over 200,000 Minnesotans that we need to raise awareness and go out there, do civil disobedient actions and talk to people and educate people about climate. Next slide, please. 60% of Americans report that they are somewhat very worried, and yet only 36% ever discuss climate change with family and friends. I know that when I started MN 350, I'm often asked, how's your new job going? And it is my direct opening to be able to have conversations with my community that I have not probably had as much conversation with them about climate that I am now in this position. Next slide, please. So our research shows that a majority of people in the US concerned about the climate crisis, a majority of people in Minnesota want our state to lead in this area. And we've heard from our state to say that they want to be the one to lead in this area as well. But unfortunately, our current policies do not reflect what people really want. Next slide, please. So in order to get the high-level systems change necessary to combat crisis, we need to activate a critical mass of people and get them to take direct action. Next slide. So at MN 350, we work on transportation sector to promote clean carbon pollution. We support our indigenous water protectors. We have a C4, so we educate our elected officials. In fact, we endorse elected officials who are climate friendly as well. We have a People's Climate Equity Plan to create greenhouse and green jobs and more. So this is the work that MN 350 is doing. Next slide. So while climate action is stalling now at the federal level, we have every opportunity to make change here, and we have every opportunity to make bold local level changes. This is where most of the big movements start historically, it's still no different. So we want to highlight the People's we need to highlight the People's Equity and Action Plan to do some of the work to bring in green jobs for communities, and especially communities of color who are hardest hit. Next slide. That's it, thank you. That 5 minutes go really fast.
Yes, they do. Thank you so much, T. I appreciate you being here today and sharing your experience with us. It's clear that your firsthand knowledge of how the climate crisis impacts health is influencing your work at Minnesota 350 and beyond. And in a lot of this work, both for RMI nationally and Minnesota 350 here in Minnesota, state public health departments are strong partners and allies. I'm so pleased to be joined today by Jessie Carr Shmool. Jessie holds an MPH and a DRPH and works as an environmental epidemiologist at the Minnesota Department of Health, where she leads the environmental health tracking and biomonitoring programs. Jessie's team builds projects to generate actionable and relevant science connecting environmental exposures, health, and equity. And I'm hoping, Jessie, you'll be sharing some of that work and research with us here today.
Yes. Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I even see some old former colleagues from along the way in this meeting. So it's really excited. I started my career in energy and climate policy. And at that time, we weren't talking about health impacts of energy and climate. And that's what led me on my path into public health. And I'm going to share my screen. So I'm going to talk today about public health practice in specific and air pollution and health equity, and how we interact in this system of change makers in Minnesota and the country. Let's see, I'm not in presentation mode. There we go. So at the Minnesota Department of Health, we have this mission to protect and improve health, and that's oblique. And so what I want to just share with you is some of the complexity and excitement and connections in what a public health practice and connected system looks like. We have many partners and many functions in that systems. And so some of the partners are groups like Minnesota 350, universities, communities, schools, legislators. We have regulatory partners at the state and federal level, local public health, healthcare, and many, many others that create this public health system. We do public health in my group, where we are looking at equity in terms of data collection, surveillance, and dissemination. That's our group's responsibility. We work with our colleagues in public health prevention, thinking about indoor air quality, like Emma was talking about, and bringing these things together. We do health risk assessment, so we're responsible for generating the science that for regulators and rule makers to have the levels that are either in our standards or considered hazardous. We are responsible for doing at the state a lot of analysis, and particularly around inequities, which I'll be talking about today. And then we also have this huge responsibility around risk communication and working with all these partners to ensure that we're putting out data that to the public that is actionable, that's culturally appropriate, it's accessible. And so all of these, this crazy slide is this complex public health system that we work in that is really driven by our partners. And that's how we, this work that I'm going to talk about today about health impacts of air pollution in Minnesota has really been driven by community concerns, just like T was talking about in our state. So I'm going to talk about a specific kind of analysis that we've done over the past almost decade in a series of reports looking at the impacts of air pollution in Minnesota. We most recently released a life and breath report this year in 2002 that was really trying to quantify the air pollution's contribution to health and health disparities in Minnesota. So looking for those of you who are Minnesota native or based here, you'll recognize this, the metro region. Those are our zip codes in our 7-county metro region. And then also looking at some of our smaller cities in greater Minnesota. We can use all of the wonderful science that's produced in universities and places like the Rocky Mountain Institute to develop locally relevant estimates of how air pollution is impacting the health of our residents. And then we can also use those methods to estimate what improvements in pollution could, how those could benefit our populations here. So what did we find? So what we found in Minnesota was that air pollution contributed to 10% of deaths in the Twin Cities metro area. That's over a 5-year period that preceded COVID. So this analysis, these data are pre-pandemic. And about 9% of deaths in those 3 greater Minnesota cities that I showed you, St. Cloud, Rochester, and Duluth. And so, over the years, we've looked more deeply into the impacts of air pollution in greater Minnesota and really trying to dispel these myths that this is only an urban issue. Because really in Minnesota, what we see, just like everywhere, is that the health impacts of air pollution are driven on the one hand by unequal distribution of air pollution, right? We have communities that bear a disproportionate impact of those, just like T was talking about. But then we also have these inequities in our health system, and we have persistent health disparities that are a product of the same institutional racism that produces, the siting of toxic facilities in communities of color, as well as in access to healthcare and health producing resources. And this, map on the side, you can just see kind of where the distribution, the spatial distribution of where we see those deaths, that the distribution of deaths that are in part attributable to fine particulate matter. And then I just want to show you, this is like, every time I look at this is like a slide that we would see in a university. In a training class, showing kind of what do environmental health disparities look like, right? So this is showing for a range of cardiovascular hospitalizations, asthma, heart attack, how those are, distributed across communities at varying levels where their residents are living under the federal poverty line, with the density of Black, Indigenous, or people of color in those communities, folks without insurance, and folks living with disabilities. So, and this is, in an academic term, they would call this a dose-response relationship. But what this is this is a product of systemic economic and racist disparities that the reason that I felt compelled, and it's important to talk about the system of public health, is that in public health practice, we are working with those partners with these various aspects of all the exciting tools that we have in public service to make change, to both advance our practice to meet the challenges of the future, to integrate now long COVID into how we're thinking about vulnerability to air pollution, to think about the wildfire smoke that is going to be an annual occurrence in Minnesota and other states in the Midwest. And then also to address the historic and persistent inequities in our system, and that includes in our public health system. And so it's really a pleasure to do this work over the years in collaboration with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, as well as our local public health partners and communities. And what we do now is, I really, you heard T give one of the statistics that was from this report. And so that is how we work together. This is my job, and that is our public health system in action, but I will repeat it because areas that have more, more BIPOC residents having 5 times the rate of asthma emergency department visits is unacceptable. And so that's what the work that we're trying to do with all of you. That's all I have. But I'm happy to, I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of the discussion and answering whatever questions you have.
Thanks so much, Jessie. And I can also say firsthand that the Life and Breath report is definitely a well-cited document at Fresh Energy as well. So thanks for all the work you're doing. So before we dive into an open Q&A, I want to just take a minute to do a short round robin of questions, because there are a few topics I want to dig into a little bit more with each of you. So Emma, starting with you, in your national work at RMI, how are you seeing states and cities use health data to influence energy and climate decisions and policy?
That's a great question, to get at that translation of health research into actual policy work on the ground. And for folks who are maybe a little bit less familiar with electrification policy, maybe I'll start there and can go through this a little bit piece by piece instead of the fast presentation. But around the country, we have examples of about 60 cities and counties in California that have passed or committed to phase out gas in either new construction, and some of them also specify major renovations as well. And other parts of the country outside of California are starting to take note of that policy action. For example, New York City and DC as recently as last week. But a lot of states are also trying to block this kind of policy action through preemption. So that's something to keep an eye on. But what I'll say, generally speaking, from a health lens, is that a lot of jurisdictions aren't really considering health in these policy actions. They're more thinking about it from a climate action or maybe air pollution mitigation sense, meaning that gas stoves, like I talked about, are often left out or exempted from these policy efforts. But there are some policy angles that jurisdictions could undertake to consider health a little bit more. Things like appliance regulations that are either zero or low NOx, or differentiated range hood requirements for gas versus electric, a lot of things to explore. And then also we need policy to make sure that folks in lower income communities are also able to retrofit their homes. So that requires things like incentive and rebate programs and larger funding programs. But one angle of my work that's particularly compelling is the fact that health advocates are really trusted voices in this policy movement. And so RMI is really trying to educate and elevate and connect health professionals with these policy actions that are happening nationwide.
Thanks, Emma. And you mentioned sort of coastal examples here too, but I just also want to lift up that RMI is doing a lot of great work in the Midwest with advocates in cities and states as well, especially around work with the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition. So I'm excited to maybe dig into a little bit of the Midwestern focus later in the Q&A. But for now, T, I'd love to ask you, Minnesota 350 has a really broad reach across Minnesota with advocates in all corners of the state. So how is the health discussion as it relates to climate and energy changing at the local and community levels?
Well, we can't do our work without our C4, which is our political side of the work that we do. So we have our C3 and C4. And so we have our C3 where we have our clean energy, transportation, and the work that our organizer is doing to try to talk to our elected officials about funding for electric vehicles, funding for school bus vehicles. And then we have the other side where we are out talking to people who are taking transportation on buses about air quality and using their stories to talk to our elected officials about the impacts that they're having, not just here in the metro, but also rural. As you know, Minnesota 350 is statewide, so we have our Bemidji 350, who's out there doing a lot of our native work about land, air, and soil, and having those conversations. But a lot of the work we can't do without our volunteers. And so together, collectively, we get together, we talk about air quality. What can we do? How do we educate the public? How do we now go into communities of color? A lot of our volunteer base is predominantly white, and they're doing an amazing job, but now we need to intersect our volunteer base with communities that we're trying to hit, because you know what? It's more impactful when someone who looks like me is coming from the lens that they can understand what I'm going through as a woman of color living in my household, and I'm dealing with bullets, and you're coming to me talking about different things that you have to find the intersections of climate so that it can talk about the social issues that they're dealing with as well, so that you can intersect those and talk about health. And also, I would just say making sure that we provide the resources that's out there. You know, a lot of communities of color that are faced with air quality, health issues, don't always have the resources that other communities have. And they're not always in the language that's easy for other communities to understand. And so that's why I joined MN 350, because of the great work that they're doing, but also to intersect the work that we're doing for communities of color and talking about air quality.
Thank you so much, T, and thanks for lifting up the intersectionality of this, climate and energy transition. I think just relating back to your slide, this is all about racial justice, and we can't exacerbate existing inequities or create new inequities with this transition. We have a lot to learn from our historical mistakes. So thank you so much for the work you're doing at Minnesota 350. And now, Jessie, as you know, Minnesota has clean air when compared to other states, but how does that not stack up when it comes to the day-to-day lives of our communities in Minnesota, especially BIPOC and under-resourced communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in Minnesota, we meet all federal air quality standards, but yet you still saw the magnitude of the impacts that we see and the disparities that those produce. We had last year, consecutive days of air quality events that broke our air quality index scale. We had to create a purple, to get to reflect the concentration and duration of those wildfire smoke events that also, are going to impact the communities of color, lower income, lower resource communities, thinking about schools and indoor air quality in schools, thinking about people who are utilizing public transportation versus in their own cars, all of the ways that we in the world can or cannot limit our exposures. And a lot of that is based on resources and historically shared or not shared resources. So some of the things that we're thinking about is, like, in Minnesota, the transportation sector is one of the primary drivers of our national of pollutant of particulate pollutants. And so, focusing, and we also know that in Minnesota, at least, the communities that bear the impact of those vehicle miles traveled are not the ones who are actually driving those vehicles. And so looking towards policies like the Clean Cars Rule, looking for policies that not only reflect, address the source specific problems that communities are facing, but also, really thinking differently at the state, like how do we prioritize our resources? How do we reflect cumulative impacts and cumulative burden in our grant making, in our policy making, and how we're doing this? And so, one of the examples that I love is, we, as part of the money from the Volkswagen settlement, where they were found to have been, misrepresenting their diesel emissions. And so there was a lot of money that flowed to states. And so when the state went out and asked people, what should we do with this money? Health equity and environmental justice were among the highest priorities. And so the Pollution Control Agency set out with health to say, okay, so how do we, if this money is being used to make grants that are going to reduce local pollution, how do we ensure that we are actually making those grants go where the pollution and the sources are the highest and where the need is the greatest, folks that have been left out of grant making opportunities in the past? And so they really developed an innovative and transparent process to make those grants, to prioritize them for areas, environmental justice areas of concern as they are defined, as well as thinking about areas that have higher rates of health conditions and health disparities that can be caused or worsened by air pollution. And so through doing that, we achieved some retrofitting of school buses, some major investments in large diesel pollution reduction that is actually going to, match the need, the resources to the need. And so I really think that, thinking towards, that how do we, in government, listen to what communities have been telling us for so long, which is, I am not just a person that breathes, right? I'm a person that drinks water. I'm a person that needs to walk and move and eat. And so all of these things, and when I live in an area with lead, with lead in my water and without grocery stores, all of these things have cumulative impacts. And so that is our challenge, I believe, in state government and federal government, is how do we match, how do we update our science, our policy and practice to reflect cumulative impacts, and even when how do we do that in some uncertainty, and maybe take our certainty from listening to other people rather than having it come out straight in a spreadsheet. I don't know.
No, that's great. Thank you. And yeah, including voices that have been historically not included in these processes is super important, and definitely an aspect of Fresh Energy's work in particular, making sure that we are hearing from the people who are going to be most impacted by policies what they want that policy to do, rather than doing it in a top-down way. So thanks for everything that you're doing at Health, Jessie. We don't know what we can't measure, and so it's just really important work. So I am just now going to do a little bit of a quick lightning round, one question here. So in 60 seconds, can you please share your opinion on what each person in our virtual Zoom room today can do to support the movement around health as it relates to energy and climate? So I'll go from Emma, then to T, and then to Jessie.
Well, it's a great question, and I think I'm going to pick up where I left off in my presentation. So the first thing that I would recommend for folks is that everyone here starting today can make sure that they're taking those health protective steps that I went through in their homes, regardless of whether you're cooking with gas or electric. I would also say to explore whether it makes sense for you to shift away from gas, either in a permanent sense or for some cooking events, and look into whether there are existing programs that could help you make that transition in your home. I would also encourage folks to do a little bit of a deep dive into what has been found about the gas industry's tactics and how they've been convincing us that gas cooking is superior, and really challenge your thinking about, well, is it actually superior, or is this just what I've been told? And then lastly, I would say to read up on this larger electrification movement and talk to your neighbors about it, about the benefits to our climate, our air pollution, health, and in a lot of cases, even our bills that we're paying. So those would be a couple of my suggestions.
Awesome, thank you. And T, what do you think?
Well, I think it's about having conversations with people. I think that we need to highlight the part of climate justice by integrating equity, diversity, and inclusion into everything that we do. And I think we need to shape the narrative, but the narrative doesn't have to be so large that a lot of people who are new in this space, or at least they think they may be new in this space, or they think that the issue is too big for them to handle, so then they brush it off. So I think we need to shape the narrative and have conversations with them, get them inspired by just having everyday conversations with them about climate. And we need to emphasize the importance of climate. And we need to make sure that we deliver the right message to the right audience, and make sure that the right audience has all the resources and means that they need. Some people think that, I worked on immigration reform for a long time, and I remember working on immigration reform. Some of them said they were coming to America because of the air quality here in America would be better. And they come to realize that climate is everywhere. And so it's everywhere. So those are some of the conversations that we just need to have about climate. When I even had the conversation with my own middle son, when he knew I was taking this job about climate, and we tied into climate and health and the health impacts, and what I've seen 18 years in the emergency room that I didn't even really talk about here today, and the impacts of climate. And people come in front line in emergency. We're like the front line, they come in and we see them at their worst. And so those impacts of climate, and being able to have those stories and talking to people about, here's what's happening with climate. Right now we're dealing with heat, and heat is everywhere, and so being able to talk about heat and tying those things into a conversation, and what can you do, and making those asks small, and then, asking them to get involved. If they say they can't afford certain things, and you know what, here's some way that you can get involved. Here's some way that you can tell your story about climate.
That's great. Thank you. And Jessie, we'll end with you here.
Yeah, I think I would keep something on systems changing, and I would, ask everyone to commit to advancing anti-racist policies in all the systems that you're part of, whether they're your family system, your government system, whether you're a communicator in your job, whether you're a data person like me. There's all of us have a role to be, and a lot to learn and gain, from that practice.
Okay, I'm going to hand it back over to Joe for just a quick minute, and then we're going to dive right into open Q&A.
Thank you, Margaret. Before we jump into the Q&A, we have a quick reminder for folks. Energy Plus will return next week at noon with my colleague Anjali Baines. She, along with Hugo Award-winning writer Naomi Kritzer, graduate instructor and PhD candidate at the U of M, Olga Chepikova-Trayan, and poet and songwriter Ben Weaver, will discuss the intersection of energy and the arts. And of course, while we're on the subject of events, registration is now open for our virtual benefit breakfast on October 13th, featuring Julian Brave Noisecat, a nationally acclaimed journalist and thought leader who has become a force for climate action across movements. You can register at fresh-energy.org/benefit-breakfast. And then finally, for the first time ever, we've created Fresh Energy branded wool socks that celebrate wind, solar, and clean energy. Everyone who donates $50 to Fresh Energy by the end of this month can get their very own pair of these limited edition socks. And thanks to a generous donor, all gifts will be matched, so your contribution will actually be doubled. And with that, I think we're ready to move into the Q&A. Reminder to use that Q&A feature and upvote the questions that you like. I see quite a few have already come in. Margaret, I think you've got your work cut out for you.
Great. Thanks so much. I will do a little bit here to start divvying up questions, but of course, our panelists, if you are just burning to answer one, let me know and I'll pitch it right over to you. Let's see, I am going to start here with a question from Anjali. So this might be kind of directed towards Emma, but feel free everyone to pitch in. So how do we educate the general public on the health impacts of cooking with gas, knowing the gas industry is running multiple campaigns to support natural gas use? And I can say, you know, we've definitely seen everything from, you know, looping in TikTok influencers to be able to say cooking with gas stoves is the best, to, you know, really mobilizing labor unions to push back on, you know, moving away from fossil fuels in buildings. So Emma, what do you say here to answer Anjali's question?
Yeah, and this is a great question, Anjali. So thank you for asking. And Margaret gave some examples of some of the tactics the gas industry is taking, so I won't go into too much more detail there. But I would say that we're still relatively early days in pushing this education campaign on the general public. And I think it's going to end up looking really similar to what the anti-smoking and tobacco industry fight looked like many years ago. And it's also taking some similar twists and turns as the lead and radon prevention programs and healthy homes initiatives that have also been advancing over the past couple of years. But the way that RMI is engaging in this education campaign is by picking health professionals and advocates as the folks that we really want to elevate this messaging to. So we are leading these sorts of trainings similar to this one that we're doing here, but very specifically for health professionals and other advocates. We are co-leading working groups like the one that was mentioned earlier with the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition. We have a very specific health working group if anyone's interested in joining, a quick plug. But we are really convinced that health professionals are going to help bring this messaging to the general public and make it a little bit more mainstream and sort of separate it out from the climate part of the argument that is not landing as well on everybody. So I'll go ahead and stop there.
Thank you. All right, next I'm going to ask a question from Julia, and I think T, this is directed more to you. So I think this is relating back to your presentation. So I don't disagree with T's statement on local action, but as a Minneapolis resident, I've become increasingly disappointed over the last couple of years with the lack of action by my city on climate justice issues. What is the strategy to influence the city when they don't seem to take their racial equity commitment nor their declaration of the climate emergency seriously?
Yes, thank you for that question. I actually was reading it in the Q&A. And I would just say that at MN 350, one of the things that we are doing is having house parties. And house parties is being able to talk about climate, talking about people's climate equity plan that will bring in jobs, create, you know, cleaner housing for people. And so we have the community of Minneapolis who's having these house parties, and then we invite our elected officials if they, you know, come and attend these things, and we get to talk about climate, and we come up with a proposal for them, some of the things that we want done. And so I think that we need to mobilize more people. We need to attend and go to the state capitol and knock on doors and say, hey, we want to meet with you and have a conversation with you. And here's some of the things that you campaigned and said that you was going to do. In the arm of climate, you said that when you were elected, you would do these things. And so we need to hold them accountable. At MN 350, we have scorecards that we grade our elected officials who are saying that they are big into racial equity, big into climate. And then we get to measure their work and, you know, do their term and say that you get a B, you get a C, you get a D because you didn't do these things that you said that you're going to do. So I think we need to hold them accountable. And we ask the ones who are coming to the house parties to not only come, but to bring their neighbors or to bring their family, bring their friends. Because again, I say that, you know, you get more when you start mobilizing and getting more people involved and you start raising awareness. And I agree, it's not enough. It's not enough. And so I don't mind knocking on doors and saying, hey, what's happening? You said you would do these things, you know, for racial justice, and you would do these things for green jobs and cleaner air, and yet we're not seeing it. And what do you need from us?
Great, thank you. it's a real call to action too for all the folks on this Zoom webinar. Okay, I am going to ask Jean's question here, and I'm going to broaden it a little bit so that we can kind of round robin to folks on the panel. So equity tells us that we must insist that all new and restoring public housing units are equipped with induction stoves rather than stoves fired by natural gas. So will this be part of, I'm going to say, Fresh Energy as well as Minnesota 350's Minnesota legislative agenda next session? And so T, would love to pop over to you. I can answer from Fresh Energy's perspective, but then Jessie, I'd love to come over to you as well and see if this is, you know, an area where we're going to start, you know, thinking about measuring indoor air quality in Minnesota as well, because I know we have heard from many of our partners in this space that, you know, data that comes out of California or comes out of New York is viewed a little bit suspiciously. So having that local data to support indoor air quality ramifications of combustion of fossil fuels in buildings really is that piece, that missing piece that we need to kind of underpin some of our advocacy. So answering Jean's question from Fresh Energy's perspective, yes, the answer is yes. We're definitely pushing for trying to make sure that induction cooking is a requirement in all retrofit buildings and new construction. So I'd say that's a legislative piece, but also part of our building codes advocacy work. And then, you know, really working to make sure that the conservation improvement program, all of our energy efficiency work, starts to include implementation of these types of appliances as well, especially considering how energy efficient induction cooking is. So I'll pop over to T, and then maybe Jessie, you can pick it up from there.
And I would also echo yes. Yes, that is part of our, it's on our political platform, and it's the work that we're doing with our People's Climate Equity Plan. It's all about indoor, healthy air breathing, making sure that our buildings are green. And so we are now moving that, I would say, even today during the primary, and then we have general elections coming up then next year. So it is our political platform that we're really working with our elected officials and with the community of Minneapolis. And we're hoping that Minneapolis will be the city that will lead by example, and then we can expand it out to our rural communities as well.
And I guess from the state perspective, you know, where we come in is really around implementation of whatever the policy. And so, you know, from what I've seen, we have, you know, programs like thinking about programs like Radon and our Healthy Homes program, right? We have the more that we can do to be explicit in our legislation, in our statutes, in our, you know, how we are holding elected officials and decision makers accountable, is to ensure that when those statutes are put forward, that they actually include, you know, equity in it. For radon test, you know, we have what we see over and over again is like, you know, there are a lot of barriers to radon, for testing for radon. It's not required in multifamily rental properties. There are all of these ways that our policies and our system kind of leave people out of that. And then there's a lot of disincentives to test because the money to actually do the mitigation. And so ensuring that, you know, that we are really looking at this from all angles, not just thinking about, you know, single family homes and, you know, individuals who are able and, you know, want to test and then would have the resources to retrofit. We see the same thing in schools. And I think that right now there, you know, with, there is a lot of infrastructure resources that are going to come to states around indoor air quality, especially in schools. And, you know, I just think that this is the place where folks like you who really can understand, you know, can really voice co-benefits of making these infrastructure investments, making these requirements and codes, all of the co-benefits, you know, for health, for well-being, for our economy that those can hold. So from our implementation side, you know, from the monitoring side, I guess, you know, that technology is getting better in terms of having sensors that can do indoor-outdoor monitoring, and we do have some of that in the state at the Pollution Control Agency and the city of Minneapolis as well. So I think we're getting there. We just have to, where we can be most effective is, when there is a specific policy or ask that we can, evaluate and help with the implementation to ensure that we're really achieving the broadest and most equitable outcomes.
Great, thank you. And you mentioned co-benefits, and I'd love to maybe do a minute round robin for folks here just to, translate what that means. We're talking about emissions today in terms of, air quality and carbon pollution and climate change, but what are some of the other really important co-benefits that we need to be aware of that makes this an equity issue, that affects people's pocketbooks, that people need to be aware of to sort of, to T's point, like translate this into a more tangible, meaningful opportunity for their day-to-day lives. So maybe we can start with T and then move to Emma and Jessie.
I was going to ask Emma to kick us off. Is that okay, Emma?
That's okay. I can start. I think some of the co-benefits that I would like to mention are, of course, better health. Well, better air quality can feel a little bit abstract for some folks. Better health feels a little bit more familiar. But when we start getting into the very specific health indicators, things like less morbidity, less mortality, fewer days of school and work missed, better productivity and performance in those settings, less health costs, meaning more money in your pocketbook for your everyday costs aside from health. Those are all of the health benefits that come along with a lot of these air quality mitigation efforts that we're talking about, whether it's, transitioning away from gas stoves or vehicle electrification, for example. So those are a couple of the co-benefits that I would mention, in addition to climate, which maybe I'll let someone else touch on.
Yeah, I think I'm going to refer this to Jessie.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned it before, but I can be explicit around, from an environmental health perspective. I want to see the maximum benefit where we are addressing those critical exposure windows for children. I would really love to see a focus on schools and indoor air quality. Let's not forget that the same air filters that can protect us from particulate matter from traffic, from wildfires, can also protect us from airborne pathogens and global pandemics that we do have some experience with. So I think, when I think of co-benefits, I'm thinking of health, but I'm also thinking about the benefit of communities seeing themselves reflected in solutions, and where we are in public trust and lack of accountability from government at all levels. It is, it is part of my work to demonstrate that we can make this change in government, and that we can, working all together. But I do think that is a co-benefit, and that if we lose sight of having our solutions be co-created by the people who are most impacted by them, then we really lose that co-benefit of civil society and, engagement and democracy, I guess. Yeah.
And T, I saw you come off mute. Did you want to add anything?
No, I was just gonna, what Jessie was talking about, I would just say having communities of color sitting, having a seat at the table when decisions are being made. Fresh Energy, you guys do a great job with that. I know some of the work that we are doing, we couldn't do it without you, but I would just say having a seat at the table in the decision making. So I would just kind of add to what Jessie said.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'm going to do a quick time check. It looks like we have about 2 minutes left, but quite a few questions to go. I wonder if our panelists have a couple minutes to stick around, if we could get through a few more questions. And thank you so much. So everyone invited to stick around for a couple more minutes, and apologies ahead of time if we don't get to your question. We'll try to get through as many as we possibly can. So I'm going to combine one here, I think.
There was one on youth.
Yes.
I thought that was a good one.
Let's see if I can pull that up. So this is a question from Betsy. So youth are the future. What are we doing to get more youth involved? So T, do you want to take us away here?
Sure. I think it's important. We just had a staff meeting yesterday, and we was talking about youth. Our fresh energy, one of the things that we worked on with our clean transportation, we started a youth high school. So we did junior and senior internship so that they can learn about climate. And our organizer was able to bring in 11 student organizers. And it was the first time they got a chance to work on climate, and it was about electric school buses. So they talked to their elected official about why it's important to have electric school buses, the air that they breathe right on the bus. And then they did a presentation at the very end to the community about why it's important. So they did an ask. And we love that program so much that now we are now moving to our C4 side. And so those high school students were done. And we said, hey, now you can learn about why it's important on a political side of climate to be able to get elected officials in office who's going to really support the bills that's important to move some of these policies that we need moved from a state level. And so I think that is very important. In fact, we are now, MN 350 is moving into our strategic plan, and our strategic plan is inclusive of having the arm of some of the work that we do is included with our youth. So we are going to continue having youth fellowships.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to combine some questions here on local action. So I think there's general frustration and disappointment that we're not seeing action on the federal level on climate and larger energy transition, which, as we have discussed today, relates directly to public health. We've talked a little bit about some examples of, cities in California that have moved forward with local action. We've also talked about some frustration about the pace of action that we've seen with some Minnesota cities. So are there any cities in Minnesota that have taken climate seriously? And is there a model to help cities with things to do, the action to take, and the pace and scale at which action needs to occur? And I'll open that up, Minnesota or the Midwest.
I don't know. I think Minnesota wants to lead in this work. And I think that right now, because Minneapolis is such a large city, that is a city that a lot of the initiatives and the projects are like started there. And I think some of the other cities are trying to figure out, is it working? What are some lessons? Maybe we can try it in another city. But I would just say Minneapolis has a lot of initiatives out there. I can't say that they're successful, but I give that they're trying. So I don't know if I can truly answer the question, but I can just say from my 6 months working at MN 350, the work that the team has been doing and the work centers around Minneapolis and some of our rural communities.
Yeah, T, I'd echo that. I mean, I think if folks, again, are looking for an opportunity to take action, I think we've mentioned a couple of times now, the city of Minneapolis is undergoing a climate equity and action plan update. And I know that they're looking for public engagement. So, I think this is a great opportunity to get involved and make your voice heard. And, I do think that there are some other good Midwestern examples too. I know the city of Chicago, for example, just did a huge climate action plan update, and they're talking about, these are some actions that have been made possible through energy legislation, but they're talking about doing, a stretch code that would enable cities to, require standards for building that would be going above and beyond state code. There are some real limitations about codes work in the Midwest with state preemption issues, but I do think that there are some good examples in the Midwest, and it's really important to look for examples in the Midwest too. We have a super cold climate and we have a very different political landscape, but if we can make durable, policy changes in the Midwest, that is a really good proofing ground to then translate up to federal standards. So however difficult the work is in the Midwest, it's also especially important. So just encourage folks to keep your shoulder into the work and not to lose heart. Now is really the time to stay involved. Okay, and I see we have a lot of questions here around appliances on our homes and buildings that are, also burning fossil fuels that aren't stoves. So had some questions about water heaters and furnaces. So what are the options for converting those appliances off of fossil fuels, and what are some of the facets to consider in doing that type of transition?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I can go ahead and kick us off. I should start by saying that I focused really heavily on gas stoves today, but gas stoves are not the only gas appliance that matters. The reason I focused on gas stoves is because we spend a lot of time in really close proximity to our gas stoves, often without ventilation or without great ventilation. So a lot of exposure, but then because we spend a lot of time with our stoves, people also feel really strongly about their stove choice. Whereas they care a lot less about their furnace and their water heater as long as it works. So for those other home appliances, we do have really great, efficient, all-electric options. So for either furnaces or boilers, you could switch out to an all-electric heat pump. We have better cold climate heat pumps than ever before, and we could share some resources out on their efficiency. For water heaters, we have heat pump water heaters that are also great options. And keep in mind that when we transition those appliances to all electric options, that because they're vented, we will put less and less air pollution out into the ambient air pollution environment, create less ozone, which we know can be a problem in a lot of Midwestern states. So there are a lot of benefits of the transition of all home appliances and other commercial buildings too. Like I saw a question on commercial kitchens, for example. To answer the question specifically on OSHA, I haven't seen as much work on air pollution from gas stoves in industrial or commercial kitchens, but what I have seen is some movement on extreme heat in kitchens. And we know that in commercial kitchens with a lot of gas burners going at once, it can get very hot in those kitchens. So OSHA has been interested in introducing some rules around extreme heat, and we would hope to fold in some stuff on kitchen electrification in there. But that's another point to add on.
Great, thank you so much. And I see in the comments that our colleagues over at CEE who helped to run the Air Source Heat Pump Collaborative are being lifted up, and that is just a really excellent resource, especially if you're looking for a contractor who is very well versed in heat pump installation and maintenance. So I encourage folks to go check out that website if you're at all interested in converting over some of your fossil-fired appliances. And I'll also just make a plug. We've had good discussion about air source heat pumps, but there are also other types of heat pumps like ground source heat pumps. And, we're particularly excited about those, especially in colder climates. If you're using the sort of constant temperature of the earth or the low-lying aquifer, you are not having to worry about any sort of heating reliability associated with cold climate cutoffs that you see with air source heat pumps. And if you're interconnecting in a district capacity, a lot of buildings with ground source heat pumps, you get the scale of efficiency that sometimes puts you, 2 to 3 times more efficient than an air source heat pump. So for a lot of reasons, we're super excited about ground source heat pumps too, and would love to have conversations with folks about those if they're interested as a follow-up. So yes, and we can chat through some resources as well. I know Joe, on ground source heat pumps, we have a good blog that we could drop in, and maybe we could drop in CEE's Air Source Heat Pump Collaborative website as well into the chat. So I will just make a final call to our panelists as we've gotten through all of our questions from our audience. Are there any points that you'd like to end with that we didn't cover in our questions that you'd like to leave our audience with today? We'll start with T and then move to Emma and then move to Jessie.
Thank you for this opportunity. And I don't have too much to add than what I've already said. It's just when we're out having conversations about climate, think about the neighbors and some of your friends and family, and those who are not so familiar with climate, and how they look at it as a really big picture thing that is too big for them to even think about, and scale back that conversation and tie it into something that's more meaningful, that's going to get them, to want more, so begin to have those conversations and don't be afraid to have conversations. And I would just say, when you're sitting around the table and you're trying to make some decisions and there's no one of color, then I would just say to you to really think about that. the decisions that you're making, and if there's no Black, brown people who are in the room while you're making some of those decisions, and I would just ask you to really consider that.
Thanks, T, for that. I guess I can jump in next. I think what I would want to wrap up in this group with is just the finding from RMI that health has really been the narrative that has cut through a lot of the noise in the electrification movement, because regardless of what side of the political aisle you fall on, your thoughts on climate change, how you feel about gas versus electric, we know that these health studies are helping us to understand the personal risks and the societal risks of burning fossil fuels. So RMI has been working really closely, like I said, to move us forward in this energy transition by connecting in health advocates to connect the groundbreaking research that's happening in some of these universities with the policymakers that are actually going to act on it. So keep using health as a narrative, because it really does work.
Those are great points. And I just thank you again for hosting this and inviting me. And I really enjoyed learning from Emma and T and all of you. I think as I'm an epidemiologist, and a lot of times we talk about evidence-based solutions. And I really want to challenge everyone that when you are thinking about evidence and data, that you not be limited in what that means. And I think that often we want the numbers to point us down a path, or we want there to be this, some formula that makes it real for us. And that's not how science works. And we actually have to do things and implement them and try them and then measure. And we can have, data that guides us, but data does not make decisions. People do. Yeah, that's my thought.
Okay, well, a huge thanks to everyone who has joined us today, and an even bigger thank you to T and Emma and Jessie for sharing your insights, your experience, and your words of encouragement as we continue to mount this energy transition and really think carefully about the public health impacts and potential improvements that we can make by doing this type of transition equitably. So thank you all today. And with that, I'll kick it over to Joe to give any last words from Fresh Energy's perspective.
Thanks, Margaret. Yeah, on behalf of everyone at Fresh Energy, thank you for attending part 3 of our Energy Plus webinar series, and thank you especially to our panelists. A recording of this webinar will be posted up on YouTube, but you can find it at fresh-energy.org/publications. We'll embed it there too, but it's also on our podcast, which you can find on all podcasting apps. It's called Decarbonize the Clean Energy Podcast. So subscribe to that, subscribe to our newsletter. And with that, gosh, I think we are ready to end the webinar. Thanks, everyone.